You hear it before you see it. A low, groaning pressure that tightens in your chest. The windows begin to hum, then vibrate, then vanish. The sound doesn't come in waves, it arrives all at once. A wall of fury. You're standing. Then you're not. Your knees buckle from beneath you. The air rips sideways, and for a split second, it feels like the earth itself has exhaled in rage. Dust coats your throat. The sky isn't blue anymore. It's red, gray, blistering with smoke. Every direction you look. Glass, blood, flame. A mother screams. A siren cuts off mid-hell. A ship leans sideways in a harbor that no longer exists. And your heartbeat, if it's still beating, doesn't feel like yours anymore. You're not in a war zone. You're in a city, a capital, a place where life was supposed to go on. And it doesn't make sense. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not without a warhead. Not without a nuclear flash. But here you are, ears ringing, surrounded by devastation usually reserved for mushroom clouds. And you haven't even heard the worst of it. You don't know the names yet. Not the chemicals. Not the dates. Not the warnings ignored. All you know is that in one violent instant time split open, and something irreversible stepped through. This is not one explosion. This is a pattern. A chain reaction of arrogance, silence, and poor memory. And for every blast that shook a city, there were those who said it could never happen again. They were wrong. They said it in Beirut. They said it in Tianjin. They said it at Port Chicago and Ripple Rock and Helgoland. They said it before the blast. They whispered it after. You'll see what they meant, and what they never understood. Because these weren't nuclear weapons. They were worse. They were forgotten, and they're still echoing. You don't see the fire at first. You hear it, distant, crackling, sharp. A warehouse blaze, maybe, routine. The kind of fire that licks quietly behind old metal doors in aging industrial districts. Beirut had seen worse. But then the smoke turns strange. Too thick. Too fast. It billows upward in a thick, mushrooming pillar. Dark at the base, light at the top, like a storm cloud forced to grow from the ground up. And then it happens. Flash. A pulse. And then obliteration. There's no time to run. No warning, no sirens, no last-minute broadcast. Just white, then red, then absence. The shockwave ripples outward faster than sound, faster than understanding. A city is lifted, folded, thrown. In a single heartbeat, Beirut is no longer Beirut. Windows explode 15 kilometers away. Steel bends. Concrete vaporizes. The port disappears beneath its own bones. You don't hear your own scream. You just feel the silence after it. The kind that doesn't come with answers. Only sirens. And blood. And dust. Over 6,000 people are torn open. Some by debris. Some by glass. Some simply by pressure. Lungs collapsed, eardrums ruptured. Lives reduced to physics. 218 souls vanish. Children. Firefighters. Dock workers. A bride posing for her wedding photo. A city's rhythm gone in seconds. And still, no one takes responsibility. But this didn't begin at 6:07 p.m. This explosion had a long fuse. Years long. It began with a ship. The MV Rosas. Rusted. Unwanted. Forgotten. It docked in 2013, carrying 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. Explosives, yes, but legal. Lethal but manageable if anyone had cared. The ship was impounded. The crew abandoned. The cargo offloaded into Warehouse 12. And there it sat. Year after year. Letter after ignored letter. Warnings buried under paperwork. Inspections skipped. Security absent. Responsibility blurred between departments. Then someone, no one knows who, had the genius to store fireworks in the same room. A match beside the gunpowder. A curse disguised as negligence. The fire that started on August 4th was small. 9 firefighters walked into it like professionals. Only one walked out. 30 seconds after the first flash, the sky split open. The earth cracked. And the sea pulled back, unsure whether to mourn or retreat. This was not war. Not terrorism. This was storage. This was neglect. And yet, it created a crater 140 meters wide. It registered as a 3.3 magnitude earthquake. It stripped the heart from a city that had already been beaten into exhaustion. Beirut was not ready, but it had warned them, over and over, and nobody moved. Nobody was punished. Nobody held. Nobody tried. A judge was appointed, then removed, then threatened. Justice didn't fail. It evaporated. And you watched it happen. Not live maybe, but online. Replayed in clips. Slowed down for dramatic effect. Played over music. Shared. Forgotten. But for Beirut, forgetting is not an option. For Beirut, every thunderclap sounds like a second blast. Every cloud, a mushroom. Every promise, a risk. You just saw a modern city torn apart in seconds. And if that doesn't make you reflect, you might be part of the problem. If you're still watching without subscribing, why? Drop your reason in the comments. We're reading. The war was over, but peace had teeth. Helgoland lay still in the North Sea. A rocky island no bigger than a few city blocks, hovering 30 miles off the coast of Germany. It looked harmless. It wasn't. Above ground, the buildings were ghosted in silence. Below, it was a hive of steel and vengeance. Nazi bunkers, submarine pens, coastal artillery, tunnels carved into bedrock. A fortress, built to defy bombs, to survive sieges. And it had. The Allies had hit it over and over, 272 Royal Air Force bombers in a single raid, and still Helgoland stood. Battered, but unbroken. And that was the problem. Because in 1947, the British weren't interested in leaving symbols behind. They didn't want to occupy Helgoland. They wanted to erase it. The plan was quiet, bureaucratic, coded under one of history's most ironic names, Operation Big Bang. The idea was simple. Take all the leftover explosives from the war, 7,000 tons of TNT, munitions, depth charges, and bury them deep in Helgoland's tunnels. Then press a button. Let physics handle the rest. The British Navy worked in silence. No public fanfare. No memorials. No global broadcast. Just detonation crews and geology experts, working on a death sentence for an island. By April 18, 1947, the tunnels were packed. Mile after mile of labyrinth, rigged and wired. The munitions, German and British alike, slept side by side like snakes in a coffin. At exactly 1 p.m., the countdown began. Observers stationed 9 miles away. The sea calm, the air still, and then, the horizon convulsed. A roar deeper than thunder. Not a single blast, but a rolling detonation, like the earth inhaled wrong and choked on its own bones. The shockwave snapped across the water. For miles, windows shattered. Birds dropped mid-flight. The sea bulged. Where there had been rock, there was dust. Where there had been tunnels, there was open sky. Helgoland had been ripped in half. A crater opened along the cliffs, 90 feet deep. Its edges jagged, raw, bleeding red rock like exposed bone. And for a moment the British believed they had done it. That the Nazi fortress had been swallowed whole. That a symbol of tyranny had been reduced to salt and silence. But Helgoland didn't die. The outer edges held. The anti-aircraft tower, scarred, blackened, still stood. The island had survived again. And with it, something older than war, memory. In the years that followed, strange rumors clung to the rocks. People spoke of radiation, of wildlife vanishing, a fish born twisted near the crater. No official reports confirmed it. But no one disproved it either. For a time, the island was abandoned. Too unstable to live on. Too damaged to reclaim. A scar left floating in the sea. But scars don't fade. They remember. And in 1952, the British gave Helgoland back. To Germany. To the people whose history they had tried to bury beneath 7,000 tons of silence. Today, Helgoland is a vacation spot. Tax-free. Peaceful. Families picnic over what was once the largest non-nuclear explosion in human history. But the cliffs still tell stories. The stones still hold trauma. History doesn't erase itself. People do. And this channel exists so you don't forget. So tell us, if you're still watching and haven't subscribed, Is forgetting the past really worth it? They told them the bombs weren't live, that they were just shells, inert, harmless. They told them not to worry, that safety protocols weren't necessary, that the faster they loaded, the faster the war would end. And so they worked, night after night, on a dock in Port Chicago, California. Black sailors, conscripted by the Navy, loaded bombs into ships bound for the Pacific. They wore no protective gear. They were given no formal training. They were not allowed to question their white officers, even when those officers bet on which crew could load faster. Their names weren't known, only their numbers, divided into crews, timed like sprinters, measured in tons. Not dignity. The weapons they handled were not dormant. They were live, primed. Thousands of tons of anti-aircraft shells, depth charges, and incendiary bombs, lined up like dominoes, sweating in the California heat. On July 17, 1944, at 10:18 p.m., it began with a sound, a metallic clang, a slip, maybe a dropped shell. No one knows for certain, but what followed cannot be mistaken. First a flash, then obliteration. The SSEA Bryan, docked at the pier, ceased to exist. The explosion was so massive the ship was not destroyed, it was vaporized, split into fragments no larger than a fingernail. The second ship, the Quinault Victory, caught the blast and ignited seconds later. 2 ships, 5,000 tons of munitions, gone. The earth split with a force equal to 3.4 on the Richter scale. The sky turned black with fire. A crater opened in the dock. Buildings shattered 5 miles away. 320 men died instantly. 202 of them were black. They never had a chance. There were no remains, just heat, and names scratched into gravestones long after the ash had settled. And then came the silence, the investigation, the spin. The Navy blamed no one, admitted no error, took no responsibility for putting untrained men in the path of a bomb they didn't understand. But the survivors knew. The men who had been forced to watch it happen, the ones assigned to return to work days later, to keep loading more bombs under the same white officers with the same silence. They said no. 50 men refused to go back. They didn't riot. They didn't resist. They simply stood still. And the Navy called it mutiny. All 50 were court-martialed. All convicted. Each sentenced to 15 years in prison. Their defense? They wanted to live. It took until 1999, more than 5 decades later, before just one of them, Freddie Meeks, was pardoned. The rest died with the word mutineer still haunting their records. But something changed, because after Port Chicago, the lie was harder to maintain. And in 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, ending racial segregation in the U.S. military. Progress came, but it came soaked in blood. It came too late for the men buried beneath the dock. Too late for the mothers who were told their sons had accidents. Too late for the truth to matter. Unless it matters now. They died in silence. The least we can do is say their names and keep telling their stories. If you're watching and not subscribed, ask yourself, would they mean more to you if they looked different? There was no enemy, no war, no dictator to overthrow, just a stretch of cold, violent water, 3 miles long, 60 feet wide, where the sea refused to stay calm. This was the Seymour Narrows, a brutal passage off the coast of British Columbia, where currents tore through rock like blades, and where, hidden just beneath the surface, waited something worse. Ripple Rock, a twin-peaked underwater mountain. Its jagged summits sat barely below the tide line, close enough to scrape the hull of any vessel bold or foolish enough to pass above. It didn't care if your ship was large or small. It didn't care if you were a merchant, a sailor, or a child in your father's arms. It waited, and it killed. Over the years, it tore open the bottoms of over 100 vessels. It claimed 114 lives. Steel crumpled against its ridges. Boats spun into whirlpools and vanished. Entire families went down with ships, never knowing what struck them. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it. And so, in 1955, Canada decided to do what no one had dared. They would kill the mountain. But how do you destroy something beneath the ocean? How do you fight geology? The answer was slow, relentless. 3 years of planning. 3 years of burrowing into the Earth's lungs. They began on nearby Maud Island, drilling a shaft 500 feet straight down into bedrock. From there, they tunneled under the seabed, 2,500 feet, working by hand, by dynamite, by sheer will, toward the base of Ripple Rock, toward the heart of the killer. When they reached it, they carved out 2 vertical chambers, filled them with 1,400 tons of high explosives, enough to reshape the coastline, enough to vaporize a mountain. And on April 5, 1958, they lit the fuse. Cameras rolled. News crews watched. Children were pulled from classrooms to witness what would become the largest non-nuclear controlled explosion the world had ever seen. And then it happened, not with a bang, but with a roar that came from the bones of the earth itself. The sea lifted. The sky darkened with dust and salt. Water rose in a column of death 900 feet high, and then collapsed inward as the mountain tore itself apart beneath the waves. Ripple Rock was gone, reduced to gravel, flattened beneath the same force that once built it. No one died, not that day. For the first time in a century, ships passed safely through the Narrows. No grinding, no sudden pulls into darkness, just water, tamed. Thousands of lives were saved by destroying a killer no one could see, and yet few remember it. Few know the names of the engineers who crawled beneath the seabed in darkness, who drilled and dug for years so others could sail safely in silence. They didn't wear medals, they didn't fire a shot, but they fought a monster and won. If you value history's hidden heroes, why scroll past without subscribing? If you're still not convinced, we dare you to explain why in the comments. It was meant to touch the stars. Instead, it burned itself into the soil and into silence. In the winter of 1969, as the world held its breath watching the Americans orbit the moon, the Soviet Union was building something bigger, stronger, deadlier. The N-1 rocket, a leviathan of cold steel and ambition, engineered in secrecy, designed to outmatch America's Saturn V, built not just to land a man on the moon, but to win a war of symbols. It stretched 344 feet high, its base packed with 30 engines, a tangle of piping, fuel lines, and national pride. It would take 165 railcars to transport its parts to the Baikonur Cosmodrome, deep in the Kazakh desert, where even the sand didn't dare whisper. But the cracks came early. Engineers warned of pressure failures, of structural instability, of software that couldn't coordinate the thrashing fire beneath it. They were told to push forward. And on February 21, 1969, the N-1 stood on the pad, trembling with stored fury. It roared into the sky briefly. Seconds after liftoff, a failure in the turbopump sprayed flames into its core. One by one, the engines shut down. The rocket veered sideways, and like a falling tower, it crashed into the steppe. It exploded with such force that seismographs lit up in Moscow. Windows shattered in towns 6 miles away. 91 people were killed instantly, but the world heard nothing, because no one was told. The blast site was sealed. Photos were locked away. Death certificates were falsified. Even in the Soviet Union, where spectacle was power, this was too big to spin, too dangerous to admit. But the worst was yet to come. July 3, 1969. A second N-1 stood ready, its systems modified, its flaws ignored. It lifted just 69 meters into the air. Then it died. The engines cut. The rocket collapsed back onto the pad, still holding 2,300 tons of propellant. What followed was not a fire. It was annihilation. The fuel detonated in a rolling wave of combustion, blasting a crater into the Cosmodrome, and sending debris across a 6-mile radius. It was one of the largest artificial non-nuclear explosions in recorded history. Estimates vary. Some claim a blast equivalent to 1 kiloton of TNT. Others say 7. Enough to rival Hiroshima. But here's the part no one talks about. Only 15% of the fuel actually ignited. Had the full payload gone off? Had the entire tank ruptured and combusted, the explosion would have wiped the entire complex from the face of the Earth. The N-1 never flew again. The program was scrapped. The Soviet Union never reached the moon. And for decades, no one spoke about the crater in the desert. Officially, it didn't happen. No footage aired. No names were remembered. Only silence. But now, you've seen it. You've walked through wreckage they buried in classified files. You've stood beneath a rocket that never touched space, but still left a scar in the sky. They tried to bury this blast. But here you are, unearthing it. If you've made it this far without subscribing to Echoes of Time, either you don't care or you've got something to hide. Prove us wrong. The comments section's waiting. Night in Tianjin was calm. Cargo cranes slept beneath amber streetlights. Shipping containers stood stacked like tombstones. The air was thick with salt, with smoke, with silence. And buried deep within the quiet, a lie was ticking. At the Ruihai logistics warehouse, no alarms were sounding. No red flags. Just over 1,000 tons of industrial chemicals. Ammonium nitrate, sodium cyanide, calcium carbide, stored in violation of every safety code on the books. Hazardous materials, kept just a few hundred meters from residential towers, schools and roads, and no one was supposed to know. The permits had been bought, the inspections forged, the paperwork signed with bribes instead of ink. It didn't matter what was inside. What mattered was how fast it moved, how much it sold, how quiet it stayed. Until August 12, 2015. Shortly before midnight, a small fire was reported in the Ruihai yard. First responders arrived within minutes. Firefighters, young, unarmed against what they didn't know. Because Ruihai didn't list their chemicals. They didn't label them. They didn't even tell the fire crews what they were fighting. Water hit calcium carbide. A reaction ignited gases. And then, the night tore open. The first explosion swallowed the horizon. A fireball rose 300 feet into the sky. People in apartments across the district were thrown to the floor. Windows blew inward. Steel doors bent as if kicked by giants. But it wasn't over. 30 seconds later, the second blast struck. More powerful, more deadly, equivalent to a 2.9 magnitude earthquake. Buildings collapsed. Vehicles combusted in dominoes. Entire intersections disappeared in flame. And in the middle of it, firefighters who'd never had a chance. 104 of them died. The final death toll would climb to 173. Over 700 injured. More than 17,000 homes and buildings damaged. The economic loss surpassed $1 billion. But those are just numbers. What followed was worse. The company's executives were arrested. Their connections traced back to government officials, to approval stamps that shouldn't have existed. Dozens were jailed. A few were fined. But none could return the lives. The people of Tianjin were left with ash, shattered homes, and questions that no one answered. Why were the chemicals there? Why didn't anyone stop them? Why were men sent in blind? Some say the crater left by the explosion still breathes at night. That no grass grows near it. That phones glitch when you pass by. But that's just myth. The truth is worse. The truth is, the explosion didn't just destroy buildings. It destroyed trust. It revealed how cheap life becomes when profit wears a uniform. And how disaster waits, not for opportunity, but for permission. No call to action here. No convenient bow to wrap this up. Just fire. Just grief. And the echo of sirens no one saw coming. There was no war. No target. No enemy in sight. But still, they wanted to know what would happen if the world ended in slow motion. In the dry heat of southern New Mexico, at the White Sands Missile Range, the U.S. Department of Defense began preparing for a blast they hoped would never be needed. A weapon that wasn't nuclear, but designed to feel like it was. The year was 1985. The Cold War hadn't thawed. It had simply become colder, quieter, coated in shadows, simulations, secrets. And so they built Operation Minor Scale. It wasn't a missile. It wasn't even a bomb in the conventional sense. It was a dome. a mound of earth and steel, packed with 4,800 tons of ANFO, ammonium nitrate fuel oil, an industrial explosive mixture cheap enough to use in bulk, and powerful enough to mimic the fury of a battlefield atom bomb. They set the stage with precision. Test buildings constructed to mirror urban environments, vehicles parked, windows calibrated, concrete bunkers, buried sensors, and mannequins, rows of them, frozen in place like civilians frozen in time, lined up not for rescue, but for measurement. They weren't testing if it would destroy, they were testing how much. The wind stilled, the crew retreated miles away, and at the count of 0 the earth gave its answer. The detonation wasn't heard so much as felt. The ground convulsed. A dome of flame erupted from the desert, mushrooming into a rolling inferno that stretched skyward with artificial rage. The blast yield was 4.2 kilotons, not quite Hiroshima, but close enough to terrify any planner in a clean government office. Shockwaves shattered everything in reach. Walls buckled. Bunkers groaned. Test dummies, meant to represent soldiers, mothers, children, were thrown backward as if swatted by God. And then it was quiet again, except for the instruments, the data, the cold, clinical satisfaction of knowing the experiment had worked. Operation Minor Scale proved what they needed to know, that you could devastate a city block, a bunker, a base, without crossing the nuclear line. You could simulate the apocalypse, without the political fallout. It wasn't the only test. There were others, Misty Castle, Misty Picture, each with its own radius of destruction, each buried deeper beneath headlines and archival tapes. In total, over 17,000 tons of explosives were detonated across the program. Practice for a war too dangerous to fight, yet too tempting not to plan. The public wasn't told. Not until years later. And even then, just the basics. Just the sanitized version. No footage of mannequins reduced to ashes. No soundtracks of silence after the boom. Just numbers. Just theories. Just reassurance. But in that desert, the sand remembers. Every scorched grain. Every fractured bunker wall. Every sun-bleached crater where simulations blurred into reality. They called it minor scale. As if destruction could be modest. As if 4.2 kilotons was something small, something to file away beneath the headline. But the truth is, they were planning for what they hoped would never come, and preparing to bring it anyway. It began in silence. A clear May morning in the desert city of Henderson, Nevada, 16 miles southeast of Las Vegas, where slot machines whirred, poolside cocktails shimmered, and no one was watching the sky. The Pacific Engineering and Production Company of Nevada, PEPCON, was just another industrial ghost on the outskirts. Concrete buildings, long shadows, and inside barrels, thousands of them, stacked high with ammonium perchlorate, the oxidizer used in solid rocket fuel. The same compound that once powered the Space Shuttle Challenger. The same compound that, after Challenger fell from the sky in 1986, was no longer being used. So it sat, stockpiled, forgotten, growing heavier under the Nevada sun. 6 million pounds of it. There were warnings about the heat, about the lack of fire suppression, about how the plant was never designed to hold that much. But warnings have a way of getting buried beneath profit margins. On May 4, 1988, a welder's torch ignited a single barrel. Flames raced, a hiss, then a roar. And by the time workers reached for their hoses, it was already too late. There were no sprinklers, no containment systems, just dry drums of rocket fuel, stacked like dominoes, waiting to fulfill their purpose in reverse. Atop nearby Black Mountain, a cameraman saw the smoke. He set up his equipment, pressed record, and then the earth convulsed. The first explosion shattered windows 10 miles away. Clouds of fire rolled over the desert like boiling tar. Steel rained from the sky. Roads cracked. And still, it wasn't the main blast. 40 minutes passed. 7 explosions in total. Each stronger than the last. Each rupturing layers of ground and air and comprehension. At its peak, the largest detonation was estimated at 25 kilotons of TNT. the same yield as the smallest nuclear warheads ever built. Except this was no bomb. No warhead, just mismanagement and fire. Cars were flipped. Hospitals flooded with the injured, over 400 of them. 2 men died. Bruce Hulkier, the plant manager, killed as he reached his car, and Roy Westerfield, the plant controller, who stayed behind to call 911. He never left the building. The blast was so massive, it created a crater in the desert floor. Office buildings miles away collapsed from pressure. Airplane pilots reported seeing the mushroom cloud from over 100 miles out. Las Vegas thought it had been attacked. 911 lines were overwhelmed. People believed the city was under nuclear strike. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Because this was no accident. This was physics obeying its own rules. After humanity failed to follow any of theirs, investigations followed. Lawsuits. Settlements. But no criminal charges. No prison terms. Just a crater. Just ghosts. Just tape loops of the explosion replayed like a horror film too loud to mute. The PEPCON site was never rebuilt. The company relocated. The land still bears scorch marks that no storm can erase. And for those who lived through it, the sky has never looked calm again. Every cloud a warning. Every thunderclap a reminder of how quickly ordinary becomes obliteration. They called it the largest civilian explosion in U.S. history. And yet, most have never heard of it. No war, no enemy, just a barrel, and a match, and silence broken far too late. Some explosions do not ask for permission. They don't wait for documentaries, headlines, or remembrance. They just come. Sudden, final, absolute. Texas City, 1947. The morning was quiet. Families moved through routine. Coffee boiling, papers unfolding, children laughing. Down at the docks, the SS Grand Camp sat loaded. Its cargo, ammonium nitrate, more than 2,000 tons of it. Longshoremen noticed smoke curling from the hold. Not panic, just a nuisance. They tried to contain it, sealed the hatches, pumped in steam, thinking they could smother the heat. They couldn't. At 9:12 a.m., the ship vanished. The blast incinerated everything within a mile. A 20-foot wave surged through the harbor. 2 entire planes were knocked out of the sky. A shockwave shattered windows 40 miles away, and fire swept across the dock, igniting a second ship. 581 people dead. Over 5,000 wounded. Entire families obliterated in the blink of an eye. Texas City never truly recovered. Not because they didn't rebuild, but because the dead were buried faster than the guilt. Milwaukee, 2006. The Falk Corporation. A bitter December morning. Workers wrapped in jackets. Holiday decorations still dangling from office windows. Below them, natural gas was leaking silently. A cracked pipe. Confined space. A slow accumulation no one noticed until it found its spark. 3 were killed instantly. Dozens injured. Windows blown out across 6 city blocks. Concrete crushed like paper. The Falk Corporation had weathered a century. Wars, recessions, industrial booms. But that morning, it was undone in a single breath of fire. No grand scale. No war. Just a reminder that catastrophe doesn't need history's permission to arrive. Toulouse, France. 2001. The AZF factory. It started with a strange smell. An acidic sharpness in the air. Then, oblivion. At 10:17 a.m., 300 tons of ammonium nitrate detonated in a warehouse. The sound was heard across 3 provinces. Buildings collapsed in a 1-mile radius. 300-plus buildings destroyed. 31 dead. 2,500 wounded. Some survivors were thrown through windows before they even understood what was happening. Classrooms turned to rubble. A deafening silence followed, as if the city itself couldn't comprehend its own disintegration. Investigations dragged on for years. Was it sabotage? Negligence? A chemical reaction? The answer changed depending on who was asking. But the crater didn't lie. It stared back. Empty, scorched, unblinking. A reminder that no matter the precautions, when certain materials meet certain moments, they answer to no one. These blasts didn't make every textbook. They weren't all caught on camera, but they shaped the lives of thousands. In fire, in ash, in grief. They didn't start wars. They didn't end them. They were simply forgotten. Until now.